The valley did not have a name that showed up on any map. Locals just called it the Ford because of the town nearby, Kessler's Ford, which itself was barely a town at all. A gas station, a small grocery store that closed at 6, a church with a bell that had not rung properly in years, and about 40 houses spread out along one road that curved beside a river. The river was the real center of everything. It fed the wells, it flooded the low fields every spring, and in winter it froze so hard that trucks sometimes drove across it as a shortcut, though everyone who had lived there long enough knew better than to trust it completely. Ellen Voss had lived at the edge of that valley for 11 years, in a small wooden cabin that sat about 3 miles outside of town, close enough to hear the church bell on a still day, far enough that most people forgot she existed unless they needed something tracked, or hauled out of the woods. She was 34 years old. She was not married, had no children, and had stopped explaining to people in town why she chose to live the way she did, because the explanation always sounded smaller than the truth, and the truth was hard to say out loud. Her father had built the cabin back when Ellen was a child. He had been a trapper and a hunting guide, the kind of man who knew the land better than he knew most people, and when he died, quietly, in his sleep, on a February night much like the one this story begins on, he left Ellen the cabin, 3 dogs, a shed full of tools, and a debt of habits she had never questioned. She checked trap lines. She tracked game for local hunters who paid her a little for guiding. She fixed her own roof, split her own wood, and drove into town once a week for supplies she couldn't grow, catch, or build herself. People in Kessler's Ford had opinions about her, the way small towns always have opinions about anyone who lives differently than they do. Some thought she was odd. Some thought she was sad, still grieving her father years later, still hiding from something. A few of the older folks, the ones who had known her father, understood it better. They knew that some people are built for rooms full of other people, and some people are built for silence, and Ellen had simply been built the second way. She did not think of herself as lonely. She thought of herself as free. There is a difference, though it can be hard to see from the outside. That winter had been harsh even by the standards of the valley. The first snow came early, in October, and it never really stopped after that. By the time February arrived, the drifts against the north side of her cabin were taller than she was, and the river had frozen thick enough in most places that she could walk across it without a second thought, though she still avoided the bend near the old fishing dock, where the current ran faster underneath and kept the ice thin no matter how cold it got. On the morning this story really begins, Ellen woke before sunrise, the way she always did. She made coffee on the wood stove, fed her 3 dogs, and pulled on the layers she needed to check her trap lines, which ran along a loop through the woods and down toward the river. The cold that morning was sharp enough to hurt the inside of her nose with the first breath. Her thermometer, nailed to the porch post, read -12. She almost didn't go out, almost. But something in her, some old habit passed down from her father, told her that days like this were exactly the days worth checking. Cold like that pushed animals to move in ways they normally wouldn't, made them careless, made them desperate, and desperate animals sometimes ended up somewhere they shouldn't be. She was about a mile into her walk, following the tree line above the river, when she heard it. Not a howl. Howls she knew well. They were part of the normal music of the valley at night, distant and almost comforting once you got used to them. This was different. It was lower, rougher, closer to breathing than to sound, a kind of ragged chorus that made the hair on her arms stand up beneath 3 layers of wool. She stopped walking and listened. It was coming from the river. She moved toward the sound carefully, staying inside the tree line as long as she could, because whatever was making that noise, she wanted to see it before it saw her. When she finally reached the edge of the trees and looked down at the river bend, what she saw made her stomach drop in a way she hadn't felt since she was a teenager, back when her father had first taught her what real fear in the woods actually looked like. The ice had broken across a wide stretch of the bend, the exact place her father had always warned her about, where the current ran too fast underneath for the cold to ever fully win, and trapped in that broken stretch, in a channel of slush and black moving water, were wolves. A lot of them, struggling against the edges of ice that kept crumbling under their claws every time they tried to pull themselves up. She counted without meaning to, the way people count things in moments of shock, needing the number to feel real. 11. Then, further out, past the others, nearly invisible against the dark water, a 12th. Alone, treading water with none of the panic the others had. Just a strange, terrible stillness, like it was rationing its own strength, one heartbeat at a time. Ellen's first instinct was the same instinct anyone would have. Get away. These were wild wolves, 12 of them, and wolves in a state of panic and pain were not creatures you approached, no matter how much sympathy you felt watching them struggle. Her father's voice was in her head immediately, calm and flat, the way it always was when he was teaching her something important. Respect them. Never forget what they are. But she also knew something else, something just as deeply as she knew that voice. If she walked away, every one of those animals would be dead within the hour. The cold alone would finish what the ice had started. There was no phone signal out here, not that it would have mattered. The nearest help was in town, a 15-minute drive if the roads were clear, which they weren't, and by the time anyone arrived, there would be nothing left to save. She was, in the plainest and most frightening sense, the only chance those animals had. She thought about her father again, not his voice this time, but something he used to say when she was small and scared of something in the woods. He used to tell her that fear was just information, not an instruction. It tells you something is dangerous. It doesn't tell you what to do about it. That part, he said, is yours to decide. She decided. She ran back to the cabin as fast as the snow would let her, her lungs burning in the cold air, her mind already working through what she would need. Rope. The long pole with the hook on the end that she used to pull deadfall out of the river in autumn. Her father's old rescue sled, flat-bottomed, meant for hauling injured deer out of rough terrain, something she hadn't used in years but had never gotten rid of. Extra rope. Her hunting knife, not to use on the wolves but because you never went into a situation like that unarmed, not out of aggression, but out of respect for how quickly things could go wrong. She loaded everything onto the sled and pulled it behind her back toward the river, her breath coming out in short white clouds, her mind running through the geometry of the problem the whole way. She was not thinking about heroism. She was thinking about physics, weight distribution, ice thickness, angles of pull. She was thinking the way her father had taught her to think, which was the only reason she made it back to that riverbank with any kind of plan at all instead of just raw panic. When she reached the bend again, the scene had gotten worse. Two of the wolves nearest the edge had stopped moving entirely, their heads barely above the surface, their strength clearly failing. The others were still fighting, but their movements had slowed, the kind of slowing that comes right before a body gives up completely. Ellen did not let herself think about the 12th wolf yet, the still one further out. One thing at a time. Her father had taught her that too. You cannot save everyone by thinking about everyone. You save the one in front of you, and then the next one, and you keep doing that until there is no one left in front of you. She tested the ice near the edge of the break with the handle of her pole, the way her father had shown her decades ago, listening for the particular sound that meant the ice was still holding, different from the sound that meant it was about to give. She found a spot that felt solid enough and lay down flat, spreading her weight the way you're supposed to, and army crawled the last few feet toward the nearest struggling wolf. It was young, she realized as she got close, maybe not even a year old, its ribs already showing through soaked fur, its movements weak and uncoordinated. She looped the rope carefully, working fast but not rushed, sliding it beneath its chest the way she would with an injured deer, avoiding its head, giving it room to react if it needed to. It didn't react. It was too exhausted to do anything but let her. She crawled backward, pulling the rope with her, and the wolf came with it, half floating, half dragging, until she had it far enough from the break that she could stand and haul it the rest of the way onto solid ice. It collapsed on the bank the moment the rope came free, shaking so hard its whole body blurred, but it was alive, and it was out. 1. She didn't stop to celebrate. There was no time for that yet. She went back for the next one, and then the next, her body settling into a rhythm that had nothing to do with thought anymore. Test the ice. Crawl forward. Loop the rope. Pull. Stand. Haul. Release. Go back. The second and third wolves came easier than the first, both close enough to the edge that she didn't have to crawl as far. The fourth one fought her a little, some instinct kicking back in as it felt the rope tighten, but it was too weak to do more than twist once, before going still again, letting her finish the pull. By the fifth wolf, her hands had gone from painfully cold to a strange kind of numb that worried her more than the pain had. She stopped for a moment, flexed her fingers inside her soaked gloves, and made herself breathe slowly, counting the way her father used to count when things were going wrong in the woods. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. It didn't fix the cold, but it steadied something in her chest that needed steadying. The sixth and seventh wolves were close together, tangled near the same broken edge, and she had to work them out one at a time, the ice groaning under her in a way that made her stomach tighten every time. The seventh one, the moment the rope caught around it, twisted hard in a burst of panic that took her completely by surprise, and its jaw caught the edge of her glove and tore through into the meat of her palm before she could pull back. The pain arrived a half-second late, the way real pain always does, sharp and hot even in that brutal cold. She didn't scream. She didn't have the air to spare for it. She just gritted her teeth, wrapped her scarf tight around her hand without looking at it too closely, and kept pulling, because stopping now, with 5 wolves still out there and one of them already still, was not a decision she was capable of making. The 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th wolves blurred together in her memory afterward, not because they were unimportant, but because by that point her body had stopped sending her clear information. She was working almost entirely on muscle memory, on the rhythm she had built over the last hour. Her mind narrowed down to a single repeating thought. Next one. Just the next one. When she pulled the 11th wolf onto the bank and looked up, she realized something had changed. The other 10, the ones she had already rescued, had not scattered into the trees the way frightened wild animals should have. They were still there, gathered loosely along the bank, watching her, watching the water, waiting. That was when she remembered the 12th wolf. It was still out there, further from the break than any of the others had been, treading water with a stillness that had not changed the entire time she'd been working. She realized, looking at it now with her mind clear enough to actually see it, that this wasn't exhaustion the way the others had shown it. This was control. It was holding its head above the surface with a kind of discipline the others hadn't had, conserving what little strength it had left instead of wasting it on panic. It was also, she noticed now for the first time, significantly larger than the other 11. Even from a distance, even soaked and half-frozen, its shoulders were broader, its head heavier, and there was a pattern of old scarring across one shoulder that looked less like an accident and more like a mark left by something it had fought and won. Her whole body was shaking with cold and exhaustion. Her hand throbbed where the 7th wolf had caught her. Every reasonable part of her mind was telling her that she had already done more than anyone could have asked, that 11 out of 12 was a miracle by any measure, that the ice near this last wolf, further out in the break, was almost certainly thinner than anything she had crossed yet. She went anyway. She would think about that decision for years afterward, try to explain it to herself in different ways, and never quite land on an answer that felt complete. Maybe it was her father's voice again. Maybe it was something simpler, something about not being able to live with an 11 when a 12 had been possible. Maybe it was just the particular stillness in that last wolf's eyes, the sense that it knew exactly what was happening to it and was choosing, somehow, not to panic. Whatever the reason, she tested the ice with her pole one more time, felt the sound come back thinner and more uncertain than before, and lay down flat again, crawling forward inch by inch toward the last wolf, every part of her focused on distributing her weight evenly, on moving slowly enough that the ice had time to complain before it broke instead of breaking without warning. She reached the edge close enough to loop the rope, her arms shaking so badly from cold and fatigue that it took her 3 tries to get it under the wolf's chest the way she needed to. The wolf did not fight her. It watched her the entire time with an attention that felt, even through her exhaustion, oddly deliberate. Not the glassy panic of an animal that had given up, something closer to evaluation. She got the rope secured and began to crawl backward, pulling, and that was when the ice beneath her let out a sound she had been dreading the entire morning, a long, low crack that ran out from beneath her boot in a jagged line toward the open water. For 3 full seconds nothing moved. Ellen lay flat against the ice, the rope taut in her raw hands, the wolf half out of the water in front of her, and the whole world seemed to hang there, balanced on whether that crack was going to keep spreading or stop. It stopped. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, and kept pulling, slower now, more careful with every inch, until she had dragged the last wolf far enough from the broken edge that she could finally stand without feeling the ice complain under her boots. She hauled the rest of the way with her legs instead of her arms, her body running purely on whatever was left after everything else had been used up, and got the 12th wolf onto solid ground. It lay there for a moment, breathing in long, controlled pulls, water running off its fur onto the snow. Then, slowly, it lifted its head and looked at the other 11 wolves gathered along the bank. What happened next was something Ellen had never seen before and would never fully be able to describe to anyone who hadn't been there. The other 11 wolves did not rush toward the 12th the way a family reunites after danger. They lowered their heads. They backed into a loose, deliberate half-circle around it, tails down, eyes averted in a way that looked almost like respect, like something closer to ceremony than reunion. Ellen sat back hard in the snow, her ruined glove leaking blood into the white around her, her whole body shaking from cold and effort, and understood, in a slow and strange way, exactly what she had just pulled out of that river. She had not simply rescued 12 wolves that morning. She had rescued a pack, and without knowing it, without any way of knowing it, she had saved its leader for last. The wolf did not attack her. It did not run either. Not right away. It lay there a moment longer, watching her with the same deliberate attention it had shown while she worked the rope around it, an attention that felt, even to her exhausted mind, less like the blank stare of a wild animal and more like something being measured and remembered. Then, without any warning, without any sound at all, it rose to its feet, shook the water from its coat in one long, violent motion, and turned toward the tree line. The other 11 fell in around it, and together, the entire pack moved off into the woods, leaving Ellen alone on the riverbank with an empty rope, a bleeding hand, and a silence so complete it felt like its own kind of sound. She sat there longer than she should have, given the cold, simply because her body needed a moment before it would agree to move again. When she finally stood, her legs barely held her, and the walk back to the cabin, which normally took 20 minutes, took nearly an hour, her steps slow and uneven, her mind replaying the whole morning in pieces that didn't quite fit together yet. Back at the cabin, she cleaned and wrapped the bite on her hand as best she could, her fingers clumsy with cold and shock, and sat by the wood stove for a long time afterward, not really thinking about anything, just letting her body come back to itself one shiver at a time. Her 3 dogs, sensing something had happened even if they couldn't understand what, stayed close to her the rest of the day, pressing against her legs in a way they normally didn't. She did not tell anyone in town what had happened, not right away, partly because she wasn't sure how to explain it in a way that wouldn't sound impossible, partly because some part of her wanted to keep it, at least for a little while, as something that belonged only to her and that morning and that river. Word got out eventually anyway, the way it always does in small places. Someone driving past on the county road had seen the broken ice from a distance and the trail of drag marks leading up from the bank, and had put 2 and 2 together well enough to start asking questions. By the end of the week, half of Kessler's Ford knew that Ellen Voss had pulled 12 wolves out of the river during the coldest morning of the year, though the details that traveled around town got stranger and less accurate with each retelling. the way stories always do once they leave the hands of the person who actually lived them. Ellen didn't correct most of it. She let people believe whatever version made sense to them. What mattered to her wasn't the story other people told, it was what she had felt on that ice, and what she had seen happen on the bank afterward, and neither of those things translated well into the kind of conversation you had standing in line at the grocery store. For the rest of that winter, something strange and quiet continued. Whenever Ellen checked her trap lines along the stretch of river near the bend, she began finding tracks. Not a pack's worth. Just one set, larger than any wolf print she had ever measured before, running the perimeter of her usual route in a pattern too consistent to be random. At first it unsettled her. A lone wolf, especially one that large, tracking a human's movements through the woods, was not something her father had ever taught her to feel comfortable about. She started carrying her rifle again on her walks, something she had mostly stopped doing over the last few years, and she paid closer attention to the woods around her than she had in a long time. But the tracks never came closer than a certain distance. They circled, they paralleled her path, they occasionally crossed it from a distance that felt deliberate rather than accidental, but they never approached. It took her weeks to understand what she was actually looking at, and when she finally did, it changed something in the careful, guarded way she had been living for years. It wasn't a threat, it was a kind of accompaniment. The wolf, the one she had pulled out last, the one the others had circled with something like reverence, had taken up a habit of walking her land at a distance, watching without approaching, present without intruding. She saw him directly only once more that winter, in early March, on a morning when the snow had started to soften and the worst of the cold had finally begun to break. She was standing at the ridge above her cabin, checking the last trap line of the season, when she looked up and found him standing at the far edge of the clearing, still and silent, watching her the exact same way he had watched her on the riverbank months earlier. They stood like that for a long moment, neither of them moving, the whole valley quiet around them in that particular hush that comes right before spring finally arrives. Ellen did not raise her rifle. She did not call out or take a step toward him either. She simply stood there and let the moment be whatever it was going to be, without trying to name it or explain it or turn it into something smaller than it actually felt. Then he turned, unhurried, and walked back into the tree line, and she never saw him again after that. Not directly, though the tracks continued at a distance for another 2 winters before they finally stopped appearing altogether, whether because the pack had moved on to new territory, or because something had happened to him that she would never know about, or simply because whatever debt he had felt he owed her had, in his own way, been considered paid. Ellen thought about that morning often in the years that followed, turning it over the way you turn over any memory that changed you without your fully understanding how. She had gone out that day, expecting to check trap lines, and had come home instead having learned something about fear that she had never quite understood before, not from her father's lessons, not from anything else in her life up to that point. She had learned that fear and action were not opposites, that you could be afraid down to your bones and still move forward anyway, one animal, one decision, one rope pull at a time, not because the fear went away, but because something else, something steadier, decided to matter more in that particular moment. She also learned something about the animals themselves that most people in town, with their stories about savage wolves and dangerous woods, never seemed to understand. That there was order in that pack beyond what any of them could see from the outside. That respect moved in directions humans rarely got to witness. That the last one out of the water that morning had not simply been the strongest or the largest. He had been the one the others were willing to wait for, the one they lowered their heads to, the one whose survival mattered to the shape of the whole group, in a way none of the others individually had. She never tried to explain any of that to the people in Kessler's Ford who asked her about it over the years, mostly because she knew it would sound like exaggeration, like the kind of thing people say to make a story bigger than it actually was. But she kept it anyway, folded away in the part of her mind where she kept the things that mattered most, the things that had shaped who she was without needing anyone else's belief to make them true. Years later, long after the scar on her palm had faded to a thin, pale line she barely noticed anymore, Ellen would still walk that same stretch of river some cold mornings, especially on the anniversary of that day, standing at the edge of the bend where the ice had broken, remembering the sound of 12 animals fighting to survive and the strange, humbling silence that had followed once they had. She never went looking for proof that the wolf remembered her the way she remembered him. She didn't need it. Some things you carry not because you can prove them, but because you were there, because you felt the ice crack beneath you and held anyway, because you looked into the eyes of something wild and dying and chose, without fully understanding why, to reach out instead of walking away. That, in the end, was the whole story. Not a woman who saved 12 wolves because she was fearless, but a woman who was afraid the entire time and did it anyway, one animal at a time, until there was nothing left in front of her to save. And somewhere out in those woods, for as long as the tracks kept appearing, something wild had decided that mattered too.